right, hello. Welcome to the Academic Canuck podcast. This is episode 1. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you like the content. And let's get this podcast out there. New endeavor. So, our topic today, which is postmodern media. Now, what do I mean by postmodern media? I have been asked by friends and family recently to start doing a podcast, and one of the topics that came up is to discuss media. And it's such a expansive topic, so to speak, to talk about media, because it's this big, kind of thing that is incorporated in all our lives. But it came to me in terms of mirroring the philosophy of postmodernism. And I guess before we start, I think I should outline what postmodernism is and its role within the current discourse today. So, I guess first things first is postmodernism is it's a way of knowing. What we call a way of knowing in an academic sense is an epistemology. So postmodernism is an epistemology. The question is it an effective epistemology? Is it a good epistemology? The answer to that is no. Personally, as a researcher, I find that the every focus on research should be about discovery and purpose. Okay? So the point of research is to discover new things, discover new ideas, build on those ideas, etc., etc. And the purpose is it's supposed to be applicable and usable for the common good. Postmodernism achieves none of that, in my estimation. Postmodernism achieves none of that. Actually, as we'll find out, it actively... How would I say this? Postmodernism goes out of its way to be anti-discovery and anti-purpose. So, in its base characteristics of the epistemology is supposed to be anti-discovery and anti-purpose. So, the fact that's what makes it an ineffective epistemology for learning and for knowledge attainment. So, that's kind of what we're going to discuss today in terms of postmodernism and media. As a side note, in this framework of media, I would say this applies, strangely enough, to the area of corporate media, both cable and online, on both sides of the political spectrum. I'm talking about news stations such as MSNBC, CNN, sections of Fox News, even online corporate shows like The Young Turks or The Majority Report. We can find this, I guess, as a sense of an embrace of postmodern ideology in these news factions. In this podcast, I will attempt to unpack this and some of the implications that ultimately come from it. I think it's important to ask the question, what is postmodernism? Now, it is a hard ideology to unpack because I feel personally it is purposely made to be flummoxing or confusing given its concept, but I will do my best to make it clear and concise and to divide it in themes to make it digestible for you as the listener. So a common misconception, I would say, would be that postmodernism stemmed from a Marxist communist doctrine, which is... I would say it's about half true, that concept. We will get there in terms of how the concept of postmodernism, I guess, planted the seed for Marxism, but actually the idea, although it was not called postmodernism, predates Karl Marx. If I may be so kind, in actuality, postmodernism dates as far back as Immanuel Kant and his critique of Copernican scientific concepts, originating with this idea of skepticism, especially with regard to Enlightenment thinkers. The origins of postmodernism are attributed to a German philosopher named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. This would then start the tree leading into the derealization concepts of cultural critics such as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Bergson, etc., leading to the existentialists, more succinctly Jean-Paul Sartre, who I believe is the originator of this epoch of postmodernity, epoch spelled E-P-O-C-H. This is relevant especially with his work on the concept of the being and existence, the being of human and the existence thereof of that human. He held this concept that existence precedes essence along lines of subjective observation about experience. Like I said, these are very thick and dense concepts. They can be difficult to understand. But essentially what Sartre provides is that your being itself does come at the expense of the existence that you perceive. So your being is not being unless you perceive it to be your being. Like I said, this stuff is very thick and very dense. So it's understandable that it's quite difficult to understand, which, you know, you hear this talk about postmodernity in news and on certain media and how it's in the school, and I feel that most people struggle with understanding it because they don't know too much about it, because who would want to learn this stuff? It's completely nutty ideology. So I think what's best for me now to do in this framework in talking about media is to condense postmodernity down to 3 basic concepts. I would say if you want a more in-depth understanding of postmodernity and some of the authors that stem from Jean-Paul Sartre, such as Herbert Marcuse, Theodore Adorno, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, etc., Jean-François Lyotard, I recommend reading Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, as they give a very in-depth and baseline information of postmodernity and all of the disciplines that stem off of it. So I definitely recommend giving their book a read. With that said, one of the areas that you should pick up on in terms of postmodernity that I discussed recently was this concept of embracing skepticism and derealization. And I'm not against skepticism. Skepticism is fine when it's done correctly, say in the form of scientific discovery or the scientific method, or skepticism to reach a form of empiricism through scientific discovery. That is absolutely fine. But this concept of derealization is a whole other situation. And then this leads to the first themes of postmodernism, followed by themes 2 and 3 that I will provide. So first theme is an acceptance of subjective reality and rejection of an objective reality. Okay? So acceptance of reality based on personalized or sensory experience. That's first key theme of postmodernity. The second key theme is a deconstruction of linguistics, or a fractioned analysis of language. Okay? Third theme is power and oppression dynamics. All society is based on power and oppression dynamics. Okay? So, essentially what we have here, subjective reality, deconstruction of language, power and oppression dynamics. Those are the three key themes within postmodernity that we will discuss in relation to the media. So, the next question is, how does this fit inside of the media? Well, first, let's look at media's subjective truth. It is clear that our society is extremely polarized in this day and age, especially in the socio-political landscape. This creates a breeding ground for subjectivity in the news to come to the forefront and be a tool used by the corporate media, for example. And this is used to drive ratings, for example. I look at someone like Matt Taibbi and his book, Hate Inc., where he describes media moving away from this competition for covering stories, much like how NBC, ABC, CBS did back in the day, to this economic concept of owning a certain socio-political demographic, especially with the advent of cable news in the late 80s. I feel from that concept of dominating a demographic opens the door, so to speak, for subjective truth or reality. Because in some instances, reality might not be all that exciting, but not all that exciting does not drive ratings. So, that's just kind of a social algebra, putting it all together there in a sense. But, if you were to put yourself in the newsroom for a moment, the question would be, how are the optics for the story in relation to our demographics? So, one of the biggest examples would be, what would that question be like in a CNN newsroom? What would that question be like in a Fox newsroom? What would that question be like in MSNBC? What would that question be like at the Young Turks? So it depends on the certain medium and what is provided by the medium in order to understand this dynamic of what are the optics in relation to the subjective storytelling that the news portrays. I think it's good to use CNN for an example right now. I will use Fox News in a minute, but let's use CNN for example right now, who for the past 4 years built a monetized framework on bashing Donald Trump. What we can see now with the current coverage is that it still follows Donald Trump almost a month out of his office. The disdain for him was, in a simple sense, not applicable disdain or tangible in any way, because he for the most part drove ratings for CNN. But the fact that we are a full month into a brand new administration and that still grabbing of the Trump storyline remains supreme, because they built a monetized framework on it. And when subjectivity comes into play, you think that every story about Trump is breaking news or a level of excitement that needs to be achieved, but it's not. So they use their news or their resources within the news landscape to make it exciting or enthralling to keep viewers in, even though the discussion about a citizen now is nothing to write home about. Fox News can use for the same discussion and the bashing of the Biden administration, but I think mostly the subjectiveness comes from the framing of similar stories. I'm going to recommend a good resource for people in terms of what to find with news. It's a site called Ground News. And what they do is they provide the baseline news story and the headline and the lead from many different news sites and their political leanings. So you might get the same discussion about a story and how is it framed inside of a CNN context compared to a Fox News context, compared to, so we're in Canada here, from a CTV news context, CBC news context, to a Toronto Sun, National Post context, that sort of thing. So I think that's I recommend go checking out that site. And one example that I found from that site that was interesting in the news recently, the discussion about Aunt Jemima syrup. Now, I know I started this podcast talking about deep concepts such as postmodernity and media, but I think this Aunt Jemima story is pretty salient to this topic of subjectivity. First, you have the story about Aunt Jemima syrup is changing its name. That is the news right there. Aunt Jemima syrup has changed its name. So how is this news story seen through a subjective political lens? Well, for example, you have CNN says Aunt Jemima finally has a new name. So this concept of finally is obviously rooted in the controversy about Aunt Jemima's apparent racist past. So that's why CNN uses the Aunt Jemima finally has a new name, essentially saying, finally, Aunt Jemima is not a catalyst for racist America, so to speak. Fox, on the other hand, wonders if this means racism is over now, and the critics that disavow the change. So there's the other side of the coin of the people not liking the change because they don't subscribe to this this orthodoxy that has come over the American public in regards to the critical race theory, race relations that have happened, especially over the past year. Other examples of this that are clearly subversive tactics in the coverage of riots, depending on the political party. I must say CNN has been the worst culprit of this, given the disdain for the anti-lockdown protests, but this laissez-faire treatment on BLM protests and riots, and then coming back full circle and being very harsh on the Capitol riots. This double standard is creating the subjective reality, and you've seen it from people. You've seen it proliferate from people that say, yes, anti-lockdown protests are bad, they're killing people, but Black Lives Matter protests are fine. And that's using subjective reality and subjective truth to make it pure truth. And that is a dangerous concept, especially when used in our media. This is a clear example of subjective view on similar news stories and how they are tailored and manicured to an individual's worldview. It is so unfortunate because for people not in tune with the structure of media, it becomes objective to what their side is telling them, hence the polarization. The second area of topic is when we talk about deconstruction of language. And this follows how certain words are used within certain broadcasts. For example, since Joe Biden has taken office, news on the coronavirus has had a lot less of the word startling or grim new milestones relating to COVID deaths. One of the most, I would say, incendiary examples of language relating to deconstruction are the use of certain words where they are not supposed to be in place. Key example is the phrase white supremacist. Now, this word is a contentious word, and it's used quite often by numerous people in a landscape, and I feel that a lot of people, because they're deconstructing this language and either using it more frequently than it should. But I would say you mustn't use that word unless it's absolutely clear that an individual has advocated for the advancement of the white race over any other race, which is abhorrent. That is abhorrent behavior. It should be used in that instance. The way that it's used recently as saying, a senator disagreeing on a policy in a bill does not constitute that senator, he or she, to be a white supremacist or racist. That's just asinine. This needs to be abundantly clear, given certain sides of the spectrum advocate for meaning in speech. Therefore, you must be serious in how you use certain speech in certain contexts. Yes, I understand that freedom of speech still applies, but when challenged, you must be held to account for that speech you use. I'm not against certain accountability, as in criticism of speech. So if someone uses white supremacists out of context, you should be able to challenge that person. No, because a Republican senator disagrees with a bill, that does not make him or her a white supremacist. That is wrong. You should not be using that language when it doesn't fit. Racist. You should not be using that language when it doesn't fit. That is, you have to call out this, essentially this fractionated analysis of language, or this deconstruction of language in terms of using words in a laissez-faire way in order to score points, especially in an ideological battlefield. I understand, again, that freedom of speech still applies. But, when you see shows like I know that the Young Turks is guilty with this. The Majority Report with Sam Cedar is guilty with this as well. They use the word white supremacist sort of blasé, oh yeah, he or she is a white supremacist, yeah, yada, 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 that's it, that's that. That's incorrect. That is incorrect, and they should be called out for that incorrectness in their words. One channel I recommend watching is a young man called Actual Justice Warrior. This is where he analyzes and dissects the language of these channels, notably the Young Turks, and their absurd usage and dissection of the language, I guess to score political points for their own demographic. Third theme that I wanted to talk about is, I think, one of the biggest themes, especially within postmodernity, and it's also found in media. And it's the media's power and oppression dynamics. This is a common theme in postmodernity, and I'm sure you have experienced this, especially wherever you're hearing the news in this talk about white male privilege or class privilege. That comes from a basis of power and oppression dynamics, that the white male has privilege over anyone else. So the white male, he holds the power over the oppressed, or the rich person holds the power over the oppressed. That's kind of like I told you we would return to this idea of Marxist power and oppression dynamics. That's kind of when we talk about class privilege. And this comes from a consistent and all-encompassing power narrative that postmodernists agree is central to all social interaction. So you can't live in a world, essentially, or you can't live in a socialized world without being introduced or a part of this power and oppression dynamic. Now, how might this be shown in media? Well, now that we have the media's subjectivity in stories paired with their deconstruction of linguistics, you find that they take on the role of the powerful, given they have you submitted, so to speak, in this rhetorical battle that you didn't even ask for. So it's almost like the media just hits you in the face with this content, this divisive rhetoric, this subjective, subversive content, this mixing and deconstructing of words, and it kind of catches you off guard. You get essentially thrown into this philosophical gymnastic competition, and it automatically puts you into the position of the oppressor, in a way, or the oppressed, I should say. so have it be news stories about, Black Lives Matter or Capitol riots. The fact to remain, the power does not lie in the actual social examples, either through the people rioting for racial justice or the individuals that had doubts or questions about the legitimacy of the election. Rather, it's not about these specific social examples. Even though the news frames it in a way that it's about these social examples, it's never about that. Rather, it is in the arena between product and consumer. It comes down to an economic understanding. The product did its job in terms of its divisive rhetoric and creating its power and oppression dynamics, because you're still watching and they're still broadcasting to you. So it comes down between product and consumer, and it did its job in the end in terms of luring in the consumer, much like with cigarettes or fast food or whatever it does. So I think that's an important thing to look out for. Another thing is, of course, this is used through many auditory ways. Obviously, color, sound, shapes, all those things combined with the rhetorical tools create the power and dependence without you knowing or willingly partaking. And I think that's a very important point, especially when discussing postmodernity and media. They know and understand this dynamic. They use it, and they use it almost kind of they kind of sneak in through the back door and introduce this stuff. So that's essentially an analysis on those 3 points right there. So we're about, I guess, close to a half hour into this podcast right now, 27 minutes. I think it's important to give kind of an analysis up to this point, especially because I can understand the topic of postmodernity. Again, I recommend reading Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. Even look at some of the online videos from Gad Saad or James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, Peter Boghossian themselves when they talk about postmodernity. Stephen Hicks is another one. I recommend looking at those. Even look at some the other side of postmodernity to get a history lesson on it. I think would be great. Essentially, so to kind of start to sum this up with an analysis of some sorts, if you were to agree with these sentiments, what can we conclude from media and its relation in postmodernity? Well, we can conclude the current state of mainstream media is failing. It is. By using this postmodern type of concept within their reporting, we've already seen through numerous polls, numerous discussion, especially through the online media, that this concept of the mainstream media is failing. Ever since Joe Biden came into office, massive ratings dumps happened, and it's clear perhaps more people are catching on. Perhaps people want to take a break. They're coming up from this drowning in the postmodernity lake of never-ending rhetorical water, so to speak, to give a wayward analogy. So yeah, we can conclude that the current state of mainstream media is failing. I personally do not see channels like CNN or MSNBC being relevant in the next 4 years' time. I honestly don't. I don't see their business model holding up, especially with how things are going right now. A lot of people starting to call out these concepts and maybe starting to think a little bit deeper of where they get their news, where they get their information, more places to get your information, more areas in the online sphere where you can get information. So I think that's going to add further to the death knell of mainstream media stations. I think it's important that one is able to triangulate kind of this postmodern field to kind of create your own basis for how you see media. One example I use is how I triangulate data, especially with doing research, for example. So one way to look at this is to see that current media is not working. Thus, postmodernity in practice does not work. I would say, I guess one way to frame this is that with the current media landscape not working, it's postmodernity in practice is not working. And I would say this is a fair conclusion, given the examples that were provided. I would say approval for institutions outside of media have also dropped precipitously, perhaps because this kind of social framework has gotten into these other institutions, and perhaps it's infecting them as well, so to speak. I do believe it was one of the postmodernists, either Derrida or Stanley Fish, who suggested the concept of postmodernity is about playful rhetoric meant to twist and confound reality. Essentially, we have seen this with media, as it is more of an entertainment game rather than news. And I think a few people are starting to catch on to that it's an entertainment game. It's Eric Weinstein describes it perfectly, especially with institutions. It's like kayfabe from the World Wrestling Federation or World Wrestling Entertainment. God forbid I get it wrong. But this concept of kayfabe, it's a work. It's these institutions are in tandem together to create this playful rhetoric, this playful story, and that's another example I find why this concept of postmodernity is in media. It's a playful rhetoric that they're using. It's a work that they're using, to use wrestling terminology. And I think, either people are catching on to it, or perhaps maybe they're still using it, so maybe not enough people have turned on to it, which is kind of I would say is a scary realization. So I guess one of the questions that I have further with this concept is, what is the psychology behind this? Why do people gravitate to these media channels? I mean, I talk to my family. My mother, for example, she watches a lot of The View, and it seems like it's just, she even noticed in it and discussed it with me that it's such a divisive show. And what brings people to that divisiveness? And on the surface, you could say maybe people like this divisive nature. They enjoy this never-ending debate, this 24 hours of debate and constant at each other's throats. It's exciting. It's maybe compelling. But I think it goes something deeper than that. And when I think of, legacy media or mainstream media and why people get so hooked on it and hang on every single word of it, it really seems like a form of Stockholm Syndrome, where the people actually enjoy this anger and fear narrative that they know it hurts them, but they cannot leave. It is an interesting topic to think about. Same can be said about the narrative surrounding COVID. Every good news topic seems to be shut down by a negative or divisive topic, or a science topic comes in with COVID and it's quickly contrasted with a political topic, which we know is divisive. And that is a strange realization. And perhaps it comes back to wanting to use this playful rhetoric in order to gain viewers and to keep that power and oppression dynamic. So I would suggest that legacy media are akin to, the abuser in a relationship, and people are scared to challenge the narrative, leading to media creating the social narrative, leading to people being scared to challenge that social narrative again. And once you realize that the social narrative is just done from a playful rhetoric of, trying to procure viewers or ratings, which corporate media is. I mean, I don't think there's any secret in that. You kind of get to, it's a chance to take a step back and see it more clearly. I mean, I think what has to come out from this is this concept of media education, the form of education. And I say media education because that's where my expertise lies in educational administration, working in curriculum and policy analysis for education. You have to see this form of education and to see behind this curtain of the narrative. Now, I won't expect people to read hours upon hours on end about postmodernism because people have lives, and I don't recommend getting on Amazon tomorrow and buying 30 books from postmodern philosophers. Please do not do that. Save yourself time and money and not buy the books of those, I will say, harebrained ideas of postmodernity. But I will ask, to use questions that Stephen Hicks proposes when dealing in a debate with postmodernists. And I find this works with media too. So the two questions that Stephen Hicks proposes are, is this person honest? And what matters the most in reference to a debate? So is this person an honest debater, or what matters most in this debate? With that said, you can ask the same questions about media as well. Is this media station truly honest, and what matters most to this media station? Okay? If you can have that framework of those two questions every time you see a news story on either the left or the right, I think you can start to read between the lines of what the media is trying to accomplish. Are they truly honest with their story? Are they sharing all the information? Are they cutting some things out? Are they out of context with it? What might you think is the actual story? And then what matters to the media the most? Is it that they're so benevolent that they want to get you the story? Is that what it is? Or are they trying to give you something to keep you coming back? There's always breaking news. There's always something after the break to learn about with this story. There's always a new development. So I think asking those questions to yourself is a way that you can deeply understand and contextualize the postmodernism in media, as in the media stations are playing a game for their demographics that they are trying to cater to, and it's for ratings and profits that matter the most, and not truth in media or news telling, I should say. I think that is a key understanding, especially with media education, as it will give you some sort of maybe comfortability in challenging the media ecosystem, and gives you avenues to structure your ideas in terms of ethical honesty and what matters most when you hear a news story. Okay, at this point, I've gone close to about 40 minutes, give or take. I just wanted to share those topics there. At the end of every podcast that I do, I'd like to do a section called Watching and Reading. I'm a big fan of cinema, and I'm a big fan of books as well. So I like to share what I'm currently watching and reading right now. So first, this lockdown has been, I'm sure, tough for a lot of people. And, for someone who's a big I'm a big cinnamon buff too, but I'm also a big cinema buff. It's hard to even get up the motivation to even watch a film. But I started back and I popped in what I think is one of the greatest movies of all time, and that's No Country for Old Men by the Coen brothers. I hope to actually be talking about this film in another podcast in relation to some topics salient in our current landscape. So if you haven't seen it, I recommend watching it. Also, if you haven't seen it, where have you been? In terms of reading, I mentioned Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. Another book that I recommend was, another book that I do recommend is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. It was written in 1953, and I think this book is extremely salient, especially in today's climate, and especially with the topics discussed in this podcast today about media narratives and the twisting of narratives and truth finding and truth telling. So I definitely recommend reading that. I would say, in terms of crafting knowledge and seeing the forest for the trees, as the expression goes, that is a fantastic book. With that said, I'm going to say thank you very much for listening to the podcast. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe and share along to your friends. Until next time, take care.